I see the other two presentations in this session were about recreation. Mine is on a bit of a different topic. It's about transportation. Specifically, it's about the concept of 2+1 roads and some of the research that we've done at Northern Policy Institute on how these roads can save money, time, and lives. So, to give a bit more of an introduction, I work for an organization called Northern Policy Institute. We're a Northern Ontario-based think tank that focuses on policy issues impacting Northern Ontario. In recent years, several folks in Northern Ontario have been advocating for 2+1 roads as a response to some of the transportation challenges that we see in rural and remote communities across Canada. So MPI did an analysis of these roads and where they represent a good option, and this presentation will be giving you a summary of that information. All right, so I'll explain on the next slide more in detail how 2+1 roads work, but I'll just start by giving you an introduction as to why people are interested in 2+1 roads. So you can think of 2+1 roads as a response to a specific problem, and that problem is that that many roads in rural and northern regions of Canada are too heavily trafficked to safely and efficiently operate as two-lane roads, but they're not trafficked enough to justify the high cost of highway twinning. 2+1 roads are intended as an intermediate option between your traditional two-lane highway and a twinned highway. So just to be clear on terminology, when I'm saying a twinned highway, I mean a highway where it's divided and there's a gap between the two sides. So you'll have two lanes go in one direction, two lanes go in another. These are the typical major highways you'll see in Canada. The key point about 2+1 roads is that they provide similar traffic flow and safety benefits as highway twinning, but they do so at a much lower cost. Um, they've been experimented with quite extensively internationally, including in Sweden, Germany, Ireland, Finland, and other countries. And in Sweden, the 2+1 configuration was shown to save one life for every $150,000 spent, compared to one life for every $4.5 million spent in that case of highway twinning. Now, that number is likely a little bit inflated by the selection bias of where they chose to introduce 2+1 when they were started, but there are significant efficiencies and advantages to having a 2+1 road. So now that I've given that introduction, how do 2+1 roads work? 2+1 roads are quite a simple concept. There's really just a few key features to understand. The first is that there are three lanes on the 2+1 road, so you're not building a second parallel road like in the case of twinning. You're using the existing road platform and adding another lane. Sometimes that can be done on the existing platform without improvements. Often it requires modest improvements to the existing platform. But ultimately, you're not building a second highway, so the costs are significantly lower. Then on the 2+1 road, how it works is the middle lane acts as a passing lane and it alternates directions every few kilometers. That's what you're seeing in the schematic at the bottom here. So you'll have two lanes in one direction, one lane going the other one, and which direction gets the extra lane alternates every few kilometers. And then the two directions of traffic are separated by a barrier. Having these alternating passing lanes and then having the median barrier is really key to the benefit of 2+1. So one of the big problems on a lot of these rural two-lane roads is you have a high number of accidents from people attempting unsafe passes um, and having head-on collisions, which obviously can have very terrible results. When you have the regular with the 2+1 road, you first have a regular passing lane, so there is no need to try and make that unsafe pass. And second, you have the median barrier. So that means when there is an accident, when there is a safety issue, cars aren't crossing into the other lane and you're avoiding the really serious impacts. And then to give you just another visual, this is an example from Sweden. Someone in Northern Ontario who we work with had been partnering with an organization in Sweden to research how 2+1 roads work there. And he was able to get these two images of a two-lane road before it was updated to 2+1, and then the same road after being converted to a 2+1 configuration. I'll just highlight a few things here. So the first thing to highlight is you can see it's gone from being 2 lanes on the left to 3 lanes on the right. And you can see that the median barrier has been installed to separate the two directions of traffic. The final thing I'll point out is that you can see there's a gap in the median barrier at the intersection. And that's a really key advantage of 2+1 roads, especially in more rural and remote areas. Unlike a twin highway where it's two separate highways and it's complex to join them back together, a 2+1 road adds a bit more flexibility. So that means, first, at intersections, you can have gaps in the barriers so people can still access the road. It doesn't need to be controlled access. And that's important in a relatively sparsely populated area where your highway is also acting as the local road. You don't want to bypass the town. You don't want to cut off side traffic. And then secondly, it can also contribute to, again, the cost efficiencies of a 2+1 road. If you get into a very expensive section to build, you can cut it down to a traditional 2-lane road for a few kilometers, and that, again, really contributes to the advantage of this configuration. So now that I've given you a clearer idea of how 2+1 roads work, I'm going to go into a bit more detail on the advantages. So the most significant benefits are in terms of safety. International evidence shows that when you upgrade a 2-lane road to a 2+1 configuration, that tends to reduce fatal and serious injury collisions by anywhere from 40 to 80%, which is a significant benefit. It is a somewhat wide range because it varies naturally depending on the exact condition of the road, the exact traffic levels, what collision rates were before. But in essentially all cases, you're getting a significant reduction in those really bad, dangerous collisions. The other benefits you get include improved traffic flow, and that comes in a couple of ways. The first is you just have the regular passing lane, so you're having fewer motorists stuck behind slower moving vehicles. The second is you get improved traffic flow from having fewer serious accidents. Um, one of the so obviously the most significant impact when you have a severe accident is someone could be killed or hurt. But there's also in a lot of rural areas where you're relying on one highway, you can get extended road closures that have a huge impact on local transportation networks. When you're avoiding serious accidents, you also reduce the rate of that. So that's another significant benefit. And just to highlight again, 2+1 roads are achieving this at a significantly lower cost than highway twinning because you're not building the second parallel road, you're just improving the road that already exists. So I mentioned earlier that 2+1 roads act as an intermediate solution between 2-lane roads and twinning. So in this slide, I'm going to go into a bit more detail on where 2+1 roads tend to work. So at MPI, our research suggests that 2+1 roads are usually the best road design option on roads with traffic volumes between 3,000 and 20,000 vehicles per day. And when I say the best road design option, I mean the road design option that provides the greatest benefit cost ratio. You can always make a road have more lanes, add a bunch of extra safety features, but for whether that's worth it depends on specific conditions, specific traffic volumes. This is showing what the most optimal cost-effective option is. When you have fewer than 3,000 vehicles per day, 2-lane roads are usually the best option. There's simply not enough traffic to justify the cost of a 2+1 road. And then when you get above 20,000 vehicles per day, multi-lane divided highways typically work best. There's just too much traffic for those 3 lanes on their own to function. But it's also important to note that while traffic volumes are the most important variable, they're not the only one that needs to be considered. So one other variable that needs to be considered when you're looking at whether a 2+1 road is an appropriate investment is terrain and the cost of construction. So if you're looking at finding the road design option that provides the highest benefit cost ratio, the cost of building the road is an important variable and can affect it. Secondly, it's important to look at collision rates on existing roads. So if you have a section of road where there is a high rate of collisions, and especially the head-on collisions that 2+1 is so good at preventing, introducing 2+1 is going to be more beneficial. Finally, it's important to look at whether there are alternative routes in the event of a road closure. So again, in those more sparsely populated areas where you really only have one road and there's not a good backup route, the benefit of preventing road closures is going to be larger, and the case for introducing a 2+1 road is going to be stronger. So as a Northern Ontario focused organization, we did an analysis of where 2+1 could and should be introduced in Northern Ontario. MPI identified a number of major road sections in Northern Ontario where upgrading to 2+1 would provide a positive benefit cost ratio. I'm not going to read through all of them one by one, but the point is you're looking at most of the highway network in Northern Ontario. One thing to highlight here is, so currently what most of these roads are two-lane roads. However, some of them are currently undergoing twinning out towards the Manitoba border and some of the area near Sudbury. And that's an important detail because when us at MPI and other organizations say 2+1 roads are a good option in Northern Ontario or a good option in a rural and remote area, we're not just saying the government needs to spend money on roads, to spend more money on roads. In some cases, that is what we're saying. There are areas where you need greater investments in roads in Northern Ontario and elsewhere, but there's also cases where governments are currently making investments in twinned highways when there is a much more cost-effective option available to get essentially the same benefits. And just another note on the slide, the Ontario government has committed to pilot the 2+1 road model in Northern Ontario. That'll be between North Bay and Temiskaming Shores, not the entire section, but part of it. So we're very excited about that. Then finally, I just want to include a quick slide on where else in Canada this might be a good option. I realize that not all attendees are from Northern Ontario, so just giving you a bunch of examples from Northern Ontario might not be that interesting or relevant. So solely considering traffic volumes, here are some other examples of roads in Canada that could be suitable for 2+1. I will caveat this is with we haven't done as deep of an analysis on these. We only looked at traffic volumes, but this should give you a better idea for people from these regions what sort of roads I'm talking about. So in British Columbia, you'd have much of Highway 16 and the Caribou Highway section of Highway 97. In Southern Ontario, we see a lot of the highways in more rural areas could also be a good option for 2+1. That includes Highway 3, Highway 21, and Highway 7. And then in New Brunswick, many sections of Road 8 and Road 11 also have the suitable traffic volumes for 2+1. This is by no means an exhaustive list, but hopefully it gives you a clearer idea of where we think this concept can be best applied. And that brings me to the conclusion of this presentation. As I've said, 2+1 roads can save money, they can save time, and most importantly, they can save lives. Happy to take any questions.